I want to stay down here if you don't mind, in case I need a shoulder to cry on. This story is very personal to me, of course. And I guess first I want to commend all of you for being interested enough to come tonight to commemorate Yom HaShoah. And there are people here who actually knew my parents, and that is a very special thing for me. And afterwards go and talk to them. Don't ask them about me as a child, but just talk to them about how great my parents were. So while I commend you, I sort of want to reprimand myself. Let it go now. When it cycles through, it'll find it. And I want to reprimand myself because I think I wrote my marketing piece incorrectly. I made it sound as if the decisions of my grandparents impacted whether or not their families lived or died. If anybody leaves here thinking that bad decisions is what caused 6 million Jews to die, think again. They died because they were murdered by Germans, by their collaborators, as well as because of a world of indifference. Also, I will be talking about my parents tonight. And I'll talk about them as wounded souls, because they were. And at the same time, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. They were the greatest parents, the best friends, wonderful neighbors. And when I point out that they are wounded, it isn't diminish them in any way. If anything, the fact that they could be all those things after the experiences that they had exalts them. So, no, how about you?
I'm working on it.
Got the best technical people in the world here. So, let me say that my parents obviously survived. I'm the child of survivors, and yet I never thought that I would ever be in a position to give a presentation like this. For one, you always hope that someone who has first-person experiences are here to share their stories. But also because, as testifiers of the Holocaust, my parents were imperfect. My father would talk about the Holocaust casually. He didn't avoid the subject, but after working 2.5 jobs at the end of the day, when he came home, he was a lot more interested in hearing about my life than in sharing his own experiences. With my mother, it was completely different. It was clear that she was significantly affected by the war, and she never wanted to talk about it. And you know, I'm one part hippie and one part amateur psychologist, and naively, the 18-year-old me always said, "Mom, you know, talk about it. It'll make you feel better." And my mother sort of harumphed at me and left. And finally, when I was 21 years old, thanks, Joshua. God bless you. I knew that college education would come. So, one day when I was 21 and listening to NPR, a 2G woman, a second-generation woman my age, was talking about how close she was to her mother. And she said, "Mom, you never let me in. We can talk about anything. But when it comes to the Holocaust, you never let me in." And she looked at her daughter and she said, "Sweetheart, we are close. We do share everything. But if I ever let you in, there's no way out." And I told that story to my mother, and I said, "You know, Mom, I understand your silence in a whole different light now. Once again, you're protecting me. And we're driving in Brooklyn on McDonald Avenue while this is happening." And I said, "Thank you. But if you ever need to unburden yourself, I want you to know that I'm here for you." And my mother looked out the window, and I'll tell you, on top of 100 other afflictions my mother had, she was legally blind, so she wasn't seeing anything other than the war. And after a minute, she turned to me and she began. "But We'll get back there. My parents in 1949. This is the light at the end of the tunnel. I promised to bring you back here, but it's a dark tunnel. They're in Eretz Yisrael, just created. My dad is 22. My mother is 20. They're second cousins. Here, Bendin, if you can see, is where Marvin's family and my family were from, and others. We have to talk after. This yellow line is where the border was after the First World War. You can see Bendin was a few good football passes away from Germany. In fact, in many of the homes in Bendin, they spoke German before Polish. And it was more Jewish than Brooklyn. About 50,000 people there. More than 25,000 of those people were Jewish. These are the two cousins that I lured you here with tonight. On the left, Alexander Kartus, born a little bit outside of Bendin, who comes to Bendin for love. To his right, this rascal is Shlomo Lazar Danziger, often called Zali or Zali. And he winds up in Germany. But first let me tell you that Alex is one of 8 children, and his dad was a slacker because he was one of 12. And Shlomo was one of 7, and his father Henoch had 9 siblings. Shlomo Lazar, I said, decided to go to Germany. And in the last 2 weeks I learned that I was incorrect. He decided this way. During the First World War, when he was 16 years old, he was picked up and brought back to Germany with about 700,000 other Poles and put in an iron smelt. What is true is he decided not to go back. But you can't tell a Jewish story without a Jewish mother. And while those guys are important, on the right here is my mother's mother, Altagella Rosa. But the real power broker here is on the left, Itamalka Danziger, who is married to Itamalka Kartus. She's Shlomo's aunt, and she arranges later for her daughter to marry her brother-in-law's child. They are the first cousin. She is my mom's idol. My mom worships the ground that Itamalka walks on, and that's important for later in the story. And these 3 women are very close because Itamalka loses her husband when Altagella Rosa is born. And at that time, it wasn't so easy to raise daughters without a husband. So Itamalka is the boss. So here on the right, you see this rascal again, who looks like he's suffering in Germany. This picture is probably taken after the First World War. Why doesn't he go back to Bendin? Okay? Several theories were given to me by my relatives. Believe it or not, he wanted to get away from Polish anti-Semitism. As Jewish as Bendin was, Jews weren't liked very much, and he thought that would be so much better in Germany. Second, after the First World War, Poland is put together, and they want to put an army together. And Shlomo is not really looking to be in the Polish army with the anti-Semites holding guns. And remember Itamalka? Her brother is in Germany too, having a good time with Shlomo. And candidly, I think Poland was a little too Jewish for Shlomo. And so he settles in Magdeburg, which is as big as Bendin, but has only 2,000 Jews in the city. By the way, he wasn't the only person to think this way. By the time 1933 rolled around, 1 in 5 Jews in Germany weren't born in Germany. They came there because it was the place to be. This is when Anna met Sally. So Anna Kupferman on the left is my grandmother. And there she is in her engagement photo in 1921 with Zali Danziger. Now Anna, her mom went to Poland to give birth to her because she wanted to be with her sister. So Anna spent the first 10 days of her life in Poland. During that time, as smart a woman as she was well-read, she was a master craftsman, she didn't pick up Polish or eat a lot of pierogies. That was the extent of her life in Poland. In fact, her family was in Germany for generations. Right before this picture was taken, her father, my great-grandfather, Abraham Kupferman, died from wounds he received during the First World War. And Anna's brother, Alexander, not to be mistaken with the other Alexander, also died in the war. So 2 members of her family bled patriotic blood for her country. But she's not going to be able to run for president because she has a Polish birth certificate. So, what was Germany like in 1921? The first time that Adolf Hitler is mentioned in the Wall Street Journal is in November of 1922. And believe me, they don't sugarcoat it. They say, so violent are the fulminations of Hitler that the Jews in Bavaria are worried enough that if you had money, you got a place in the highlands close to a road so that if things got ugly, you'd be able to jump in the car and get out of town. 1922. Now, of course, down here, the political analysts, off the record, reliable and well-informed, say, he's not really that anti-Semitic. It's just political talk. Once he's elected, everything will be calm. A year later, my Aunt Mary is born to Sally and Anna. 2 years later, before Christmas of 1924, Hitler's released, the third time he's mentioned in the New York Times. Don't worry, Hitler's been tamed by prison. He's a different guy now. He's no longer to be feared, retiring to a quiet life in Austria. If only. 2 years later, my father was born, Arthur. Now, I thought I found a family scandal when I tried to find out what year Altagella Rosa Kartus married Alexander Kartus. Because, according to the Polish records, the marriage is recorded in 1927, which is interesting because they had 2 children by then. Now, I came and I was so excited to tell my children a story at dinner they finally want to hear. But then I remembered Altagella Rosa, according to my mother, spent all of her time looking in a prayer book. She really wasn't promiscuous woman material. And I talked to another genealogist and said, why would this marriage be recorded in 1927? I mean, Jews didn't like to go to the Polish authorities in general. The rabbi married them, and taka, they were married. But the historian gave me interesting information. And I'll also tell you that this is the only picture I have of the 2 of them. And it isn't even a picture, it's a composite of 2. What kind of picture is it? Well, if you wanted to leave Poland and take your children with you, with your wife, you had to be married and have children, right? So he went to the Polish authorities and registered. And it's speculation, but perhaps he wanted to go somewhere and leave Poland. Remember Itamalka? She has a brother in Brooklyn who's doing okay. And maybe that was their destination. So here's the question. How many of you have heard of eugenics? I know you think this is a detour. It's this terrible German idea of selective breeding to breed a higher, more powerful human race, right? Terrible German idea. So why do I have a slide here with Oliver Wendell Holmes on it? Well, in 1924, over 30 states in the United States have passed eugenic laws for involuntary sterilization of population. And Buck takes her case to the Supreme Court, confident that the Supreme Court isn't going to let the state make her go into what at that time was life-threatening surgery to take away her reproductive rights. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Boston Brahmin, in the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision said, sure we can. And the last line of his decision is a famous one, which is, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Just as another aside, by the way, these eugenic laws were not all rescinded until 1965. Between 50 and 90,000 Americans are involuntarily sterilized. The Germans used the template that they sent around the states in the United States for their own eugenic laws. And if anyone goes back and watches Judgment at Nuremberg and sees someone in the witness stand saying, we were just doing what you were doing, that's what he's referring to. And one other aside, to give you a flavor of America in 1924, every time a new Supreme Court justice is approved, they take a nice little picture of the Supreme Court justices. 1924, there's no picture. Why? One of the Supreme Court justices doesn't want to sit next to the Jewish Justice Brandeis. And when there are 2 more vacancies, 3 Supreme Court guys write to Hoover and say, please, don't send us any more Jews. So what do eugenics have to do with Alex and Alta Gela Rosa coming here? Raise your hand if you think that the reason Americans kept Jews out was because of the Great Depression. Right? I believe that. So I go looking for the law that's passed in 1929 to limit immigration. Except there's only one problem. The immigration restriction law comes in 1921 during a post-World War I recession, setting immigration into the United States at 3% of the prior population for that country. In 1924, when unemployment has fallen below 5%, and it's the roaring 20s, you've heard of that, right? Congress passes a law, and if you go back and listen to the congressional hearings, they wanted this law for eugenics. All these dirty Eastern Europeans, and forgive me, Italians, are coming to this country and messing it up. So we're going to take the 3% and make it 2%. But we have a problem. Between 1890 and 1915, 2.5 million Jews have gone past the Statue of Liberty during our open door policy. And you know what? 2% of 2.5 million is a lot of Jews. So not only are we going to make 3% 2%, but we're going to count from when? From the census of 1890, before the 2.5 million Jews came in. As a result, only 2,000 people from Russia are entitled to come in. And the number from Poland is about 5,000. That's not Jews. That's any Poles. All right? So if you're wondering why a mishpacha wasn't getting out of town, Congress never had to pass another law after the Immigration Act of 1924. In fact, this wasn't repealed until 1950s, and it's one of the reasons that my family was separated again. Back in Poland in the 1930s, Alex and Alta Gela Rosa have children. They have the 2 illegitimate children I told you about, Jacob and Chaya. My mother's born in 1929, Pesla is born in 1933, and Rivka is born in 1934. And I'll tell you, this, by the way, is the beautiful synagogue of Bedzin. It's not my grandfather's house. But my grandfather was doing great. If he was thinking of leaving before, he isn't now. Because why would he want to leave his servants? We have the 1939 census of Jews in Bedzin. He's essentially living on Park Avenue. And my mom said they had servants. Ada Malka is living with them. The other sister is living down the street. And he is an owner of a bank. And so he's not going anywhere. Why would he want to? Life is pretty sweet. I didn't tell you that Shlomo Lazar, after being an iron smelter, became a master shoemaker, but he had a better idea. His idea was to become a shopkeeper in Germany. Oy. So, this is probably the last smiling picture I have of my grandfather and my dad till the war is over. Here is, I believe, the sixth birthday. It was a warm day in October for Arthur. I don't know if the horse was named Adolf that gave them extra joy there, but 2 months later, Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany, right? And in the 8 months between that and my father's first day of school, Jews are fired from any government job. They're thrown out of the universities. Book burnings happen in May, particularly Jewish books. There's spontaneous boycotts of Jewish businesses. And guess what? Any Jew who wasn't born in Germany loses their citizenship, including Shlomo, Lazar, and 10-day in Poland, Anna. And that's important for a little bit later in this story. My father's first day at school wasn't a lot of fun. They replaced his teacher with a Nazi who invited Jews and dogs to go to the back of the room. My father wasn't just the only Jewish child in his classroom. At 6, he was the only Jewish child in the school, which made it easier when people wanted to decide who to beat up at recess. My dad, many times, was held down and forced to drink urine from a bottle. Because horses were still prevalent in Magdeburg, his face was put into horse manure often. And he was beaten up. They waited until his wounds healed before they would beat him up again. The Holocaust for German Jews starts in 1933. For 12 years, my father and his family would feel its heavy burden. And when he came home from school, German schools are open on Saturday, he'd walk by a parade. And if he gave a Zig Heil, they'd beat him up. What is a Jew doing Zig Heil? If he didn't do Zig Heil, not children, adults would beat him up for his hypocrisy. When he was 8 and came to a street where a truck stopped and told him to go ahead and walk, the truck ran him over. My father came home and said, "Mom, can't you dye my hair blonde?" She goes to school and says, "This can't go on." And the principal says, "Mrs. Danziger, it's time to leave Germany." In 1936, the first concentration camps are opened. And shortly thereafter, Germany conveniently opens up a Jewish emigration department. I mean, cynically, it's a leave your money here department. My father said a popular joke by 1937 in Germany, and I didn't get it, so I'll explain it to you. Don't feel badly. A Nazi meets a German in the street, and after exchanging pleasantries, the Nazi says to him, "Ugh, our life would be so much better if it wasn't for the Jews and the bicycles." And the German thinks for a second and says, "Why the bicycles?" And the dark humor there was Germans in 1936 were still in a position to question the Nazi regime. But it didn't occur to them to question the persecution and isolation of the Jews. Another thing we hear is, gee, if only someone had stepped up for Uncle Moishe, he would have gotten here. But because of the Immigration Act, it's not true. Abraham, who I told you, Itka Malka's brother in Brooklyn, goes down to New York in June of 1938. And Taka, he tells him his net worth, his income, and says, "These guys will live with me, I'll pay for them, there won't be any trouble to you." And of course, they can't come in. They're part of the Polish quota. And believe me, even if they were part of the German quota, in the first year of Hitler being in power, 50,000 Jews, not to mention non-Jews, did leave. October 28th, 1938, my father comes home. It's a Saturday. Everyone, it's not his house. They don't live in a house anymore. They've moved in with Anna's sister because only 1 in 6 German Jews is still employed. And everyone's crying. He says, "What's the matter?" He says, "Mommy was arrested. She's going to be deported to Poland." because on that day, 17,000 men and women, including Abraham Joshua Heschel, are thrown out of Poland and put into no man's land. And remember, Anna lived in Poland for 10 days. And why was it done on that day? Because the Polish ambassador told the German ambassador that as of October 30th, any person with a Polish passport who hadn't been back to Poland in 5 years, their passport would be voided. They didn't want them back either. The German Jews couldn't go to Poland. And what happened? They wound up in no man's land. It was freezing. You can see a woman there holding a blanket. They had no food. And this boy, Henry Greenspan, was so frustrated that his parents were like this, he went into an office in France and shot and killed the German ambassador there. He killed Van Roth. And that led to, as you know, Kristallnacht. This spontaneous show of hatred against German Jews. Except you'll notice this is the Magdeburg house of worship. Why isn't it burnt down? You know why? It was next to Aryan property. And so the Jewish houses of worship, 1,000 of them that were burned down, it was because they were standalone structures. And I want to tell you, it wasn't easy breaking the windows of Jewish-owned businesses, because by that night, 70% of Jewish stores had been Aryanized, including my grandfather's. In fact, I once said to my dad, "We're so lucky Grandpa got out before Kristallnacht," and my father laughed at me because you couldn't sell a Jewish store for a nickel. By the way, just to remind you, Germany hands the Jewish community $1 billion bill for the mess. And so the insurance companies wind up being robbed by the Nazi government. I guess I just like to show the smiling faces of ordinary Germans as they walk past the street. This is the strip of Jewish shops in Magdeburg. 5 days later, my father's education ends. In some ways, it's merciful. In other ways, to have your education end when you're 12 years old is difficult. And many Jews already were not able to go to gymnasium. Here's our friend Henry Kissinger down here, who 3 months before Kristallnacht, his family left because they were unable to get him into the gymnasium they wanted to. Within 10 months of Kristallnacht, 115,000 Jews leave. You know, if a rabbi said the following, you would think it's eloquent. But really, these are the words of Hitler in 1939 in January. "It's a shameful spectacle to see how the whole democratic world is oozing sympathy for the poor, tormented Jewish people, but remains hard-hearted and obdurate when it comes to helping them, which is surely, in view of its attitude, their duty." He speaks for 2.5 hours. My father, in his little kitchen, his transistor, listens to this 2.5-hour speech that's interrupted every 3 minutes for wild acclaim. And you'll notice here that the Times said, amid the evening's wildest acclaim, Hitler said, and this part is taken out, "I'm a great prophet, and I prophesy to all of you tonight that if there's a world war, it will mean," the word he used is the extermination of the Jewish race in Europe. Well, if you weren't going to get out of Germany before, it was frantic now. No one knew where to go, how, or when. This is my father's cousin, Ruth. She manages to go on the first Kindertransport to the UK. There are these wonderful, horrible letters preserved from her family, her sister's living with my dad, to Ruth. And the letters go from the very personal of interest to me. My poor father, his mother's not there, every day crawls into a different person's bed in the morning for comfort. And how, you know, my grandpa Zali is going to no man's land every weekend, leaving Mary and Arthur there to see his wife and sometimes to be met there by his parents from Bendine. To the general, what you've heard of any Jewish family at that time. Go to the shul, get $50 for us. Tell him it'll make the difference of life and death. Or to her in particular, tell him Daddy can be a beadle in the shul so he won't be a burden. And they say how, again ironically, the Polish Jews are sending chickens for Pesach. So God forbid they shouldn't be hungry. And terrible things. You know, Uncle Marcus wrote us to tell us the only time he hears from us is when we need something. And so Ruth uses up one of the first spots on the Kindertransport, gets tuberculosis in London, and her parents are saved because they get a compassionate visa to come to the UK. And the day they arrive in England, Ruth dies. She's 17. Before I get here, let me tell you that my grandfather desperately puts Mary on the Kindertransport in May 21st, 1939. There's no plan of how everyone gets together, but any boat leaving town or train or anything you put on. In August, a few weeks before the beginning of the war, Arthur gets put on the Kindertransport, my dad. For some inexplicable reason, Uncle Marcus takes my dad off the train at the Holland border and brings him to his home in Amsterdam. Of course, Zali runs back to no man's land to rescue his wife. And then war. September 1st, the war begins, and you saw how close Bendin was to the border. September 4th, the Germans come marching into Bendin. This is Sali's father. His name is Henoch. It's my middle name. He has the distinction of being the first Jew killed in Bendin. First, they shave him with a bayonet. They don't do a very good job of it, but he doesn't suffer long because they shoot him. And then they don't let anyone pick his body up. 40 other Jews die that day. And in the next Shabbat, that beautiful Bendin synagogue I showed you was set afire. Unlike Kristallnacht, they didn't care that it was adjacent to any other buildings. 60 Jews die in the fire, many of them shot while trying to carry the Torahs and holy books out of the synagogue. The war is here. The Bendin Jews, because of their proximity, are put into slave labor. They sew uniforms. They dig ditches and build roads. They're put into German industry. My grandfather was kicked out of his house immediately. It's too nice for a Jew. The entire Jewish community is displaced in July of 1940. Here's a picture of the Bendin Jews moving. And again, look at the people standing and watching their neighbors. There are 277 ghettos in Poland. Bendin is one of the largest 10 to 15 with 30,000. If you were paying attention, remember there are only 25,000 Jews. How are there 30,000 in the Bendin ghetto? Well, as the Germans would eliminate a town or a ghetto, they would consolidate them. Here is one consolidation, the largest that happened. It happens in, I would say, early 1941. 3,000 Jews from Oswiecim, which is about a half hour away from Bendin, are brought to the Jewish ghetto. The Germans have a different name for this town. It's called Auschwitz. And these Jews are being moved for the expansion of the death camps. My grandfather somehow gets Anna back to Magdeburg and immediately is arrested by the Gestapo and sent off to do the building of a concentration camp or other dark things that I've been told that I don't have time to go to. The Jewish agency gives them a letter to say, these people have a trip on a boat to Palestine. As soon as the boat leaves, please allow them to leave. And so Zali is back in Magdeburg. He becomes a slave laborer in a sugar factory there. Meanwhile, Mary and Arthur have gone from being hated Jews to being hated Germans. Mary isn't seen as a Jewish refugee in England. She's seen as a damned Nazi. And my father is in a hashara in Amsterdam with other Dutch kids training for agriculture to go to Israel. And they mercifully mock him for being German. And to show what's been drilled into my father's head, he says to them innocently, not ironically, "You're a dirty Jew just like me." On May 16th, I can't do that on this phone, sorry. You can see Anna. They get their papers to go to Bratislava, which is on the Danube, to get to Palestine. Hold that thought for a second. That's not the most direct route to Palestine, I would agree. And she looks this happy, perhaps, because she's heading in the opposite direction of her children. And 5 days before Germany has invaded Holland, and Holland has surrendered, and her baby is now within the grasp of the Nazi regime again. They have 1 day to get to Bratislava and make the boat. Of course, they're detained by the police, and they miss the boat. This is the boat, the Pencho. If Monty Python were making a movie about Holocaust escapes, this and a tricycle would probably be the two funniest visuals that they could possibly use. First of all, the Danube is a river, and this is a riverboat, a steamboat at that. It has a capacity of 40 people, and it's about to be sent to the scrap shop. So, of course, the Jewish Agency spends $500,000 in today's dollars to buy it, to rescue the Jewish community. Alexander Citron, who's the leader of the Beitar, has 300 of his men there, and 100 Germans join them, and they build out bunks for all these Jews. There's no navigational equipment, there's no radio, there's a lifeboat that will handle about 4 people. The captain is about 100 years old, a one-legged Russian morphine addict. And so they tell everyone, Alexander does, we're going to get to Salina, which is 400 miles away, and we're going to change boats. But in fact, the plan is to take this riverboat through the Black Sea, through the Asian Sea, through the Mediterranean, and then sneak by the world's greatest navy. Very solid plan. They leave on Shabbat, May 17th, 1940, and a day later they're stuck on a sandbar. 2 days later, everyone rushes to see Budapest, and the boat almost tips over. 2 minutes later, it almost tips over when they all run the other way. And when it gets pulled over by the Hungarians, who want to know why this boat is waddling down the Danube, a professor from Austria who missed a connection in Bratislava comes up and says, "I'd like to be taken to my cabin, please." You can see the boat isn't quite right. They had to sleep in shifts and go up in shifts. There's only one problem. They have food for about 300 people and a few weeks' journey. And now they have 400 people, and it's hot. They all had to turn in their bunks at the same time. I'm not joking. So they get to the Kazan defile, and the Hungarians push them over, and they're told, and believe me, we're Jews, we know how to grumble, 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 that another 100 people are coming from Dachau. Even Alexander Citron, who has the biggest heart, says, we can't put another 100 people on this boat. And they say, Alexander, it's your choice. They're going in the boat or in the river. And so Anna and Zali get on the boat. They're on the Pencho. And the Hungarians say, you know, we don't want the German oil route cluttered up with this boat. They don't bother if 400 Jews die. And so they're told to turn back. And they make a break for it. But remember the image of the tricycle? 400 Jews tricycling away here. They're caught in 15 seconds, and there's 6 tense weeks while they sit there. And they get letters from home. It says, you know, it's not so bad here. Why did you leave? And there's also 1,200 Jews in a refugee camp in Koldova. They say, Alex, let us off the boat. Let us go to Koldova. Let us go home. But no one is allowed to leave. Within a year, the 1,200 the Jews in Koldova, 50 at a time, over 2 days are shot and dumped into the Danube. This is the route from Bratislava down here to Salina, where the new boat was going to be. It took them 4 months to traverse that distance. We could probably walk that distance in 4 months. And now they get to Salina and are told, sorry, no boat. And if there's ever a movie made, in one of the better scenes, the British ambassador or consul gets on the boat, and he looks at Citron and he says, where do you Jews think that you're going? You don't think you're going to Palestine, do you? And Citron looks at him and says, we're going to Paraguay. And then, chutzpahdik, he turns, not seichel, but chutzpahdik. He turns to the captain and says, these are the prison charges and sentences that you and your men will do if you're caught smuggling these Jews in. And this old morphine captain crumbles it up and throws it into the river. They leave. They go through the straits. The Turkish say, if you stop here, we're going to cut your anchor. They get to Lesbos, and the Greeks give them food and fruit. It's the first hospitality they felt in forever. And they're allowed to go to Athens, and they ask on September 30th if they can stay for Rosh Hashanah. And the Athens Jewish community slaughters a cow for them and sends it to them. And just to show Jews no gratitude, the Jews say, it's going to mess up the kashrut if that cow comes here onto the boat. These are Sephardic Jews. We don't know if they know how to kill a cow. And so they have to get off the boat, the ones who want to take their chances. And believe me, they're starving. Don't get me wrong, they're starving. And so they go off, and as their journey begins, the 2 Italian torpedo boats come up to them, and it's dusk. And that's important because if it was 1 hour later, the Italian torpedo boat would have sunk them. And said they can't believe why women's underwear is on where the national flag is supposed to be. And they give the Jews fruit. The officers give candy to the 20 or so children on the boat. And they're saying, these are Hitler's allies? What's going on here? And if it's not enough, they say, look, there's another minefield ahead. We'll show you how to get through it, and we have a suggestion of how you can get past the British Army. There's only one problem. A steamboat needs water. It needs fresh water, and they're in the Mediterranean now. And so right here is the end of the Pencho's journey as a steamboat. And it becomes a sailboat. And they try and go to this island Kamenisi, which is about the size of Manhattan. It's a big rock in the ground. And they hit a sandbar. In the middle of the night, everyone has to evacuate the boat because they're shipwrecked. There's no fresh water. There's not a boat on the island. And so it's the Nazi version of Gilligan's Island. They are stuck, and all that can be done is 3 Jews get on a rowboat and try and row 40 miles to Crete to save the 500 Jews from starvation, or probably they would die first from dehydration. And the British Navy picks them up. Are they going to be rescued here so soon into the war? And the British Navy says, yes, we'll go and we will pick these Jews up. But we need to tell the Italians we're coming so we don't provoke a conflict. They know we're on a mission of mercy. They tell the Red Cross that they want to go to Kamenisi, and the Italians say, we got this. And they go and they get the Jews from the Pencho. They take them to Rhodes, and the first fatalities begin. In Rhodes, they sit in the middle of winter in a mud field in tents. And in a failure of humanity, no one wants to feed them. 6 starve to death. The Jewish community says, it's really the Italian provisional government's responsibility. The Italian provisional government says, we didn't bring them here, the Navy did, let them feed them. The Navy said, they're Jews, let the Jews feed them. And so while they argue, Jews die of hunger. Eventually, the Jewish agencies give a lira a day a person to feed them. And before the winter is over, the Italians mercifully move the Jews to the bottom, to the basement of the Italian bunkers, which is a good place to be because during the German During the air raids by the British, the Italians come and hide under the bunks of the Jews. Back in Poland, the profiteers have moved into Bedzin. More than 10% of the town now is made up of German profiteers. The Jews are used for slave labor. If you see on their arms, they begin to wear badges. People are dying. Remember, half the town is Jewish, and now they're living in the area that's as big as a postage stamp. They're dying of disease, of starvation, and just for fun, the Germans hang about 50 people a week, terrifyingly for doing things that every Jew in the Bedzin ghetto is doing, for having a Jewish book, for teaching their children. Remember, in 1939, my mother's education stopped after 10 years, for trading their watch for food, for being outside of the ghetto after 5 o'clock. At the end of 1942, my grandparents are moved from Rhodes to Ferramonte. 5 Jews decide we're going to be smart and stay here with the people of Rhodes. They get married, they find jobs, they get dispensation. Everyone else comes to this camp and sees a sign that says Concentration Camp Ferramonte, and they think Gewalt. But it turns out a Italian concentration camp isn't a concentration camp. There are 1,500 Jews already there. I guess in the extended play version of this, I'll tell you the first baby born is named Benito in the Jewish community. And they have restaurants. They organize schools. They have musical groups and theaters. They can go to different restaurants, but I wish I were joking. There's even a Chinese restaurant, so people have somewhere to go on Christmas in Ferramonte. And so everything is okay till about November of 1942 when 3 Jews show up from Treblinka and tell the folks at Ferramonte what is going on in Europe. And remember Bratislava? In that time, 20,000 young people are taken out of Bratislava and sent to work. Finally, the church in Bratislava finds a conscience, and they say, you need to reunite these families with their young people. And the government says, well, we're going to need money for that. The Germans aren't just going to take 20,000 people who aren't old people who can't do work. And they go to the Germans, and the government just asks for one thing. Please don't send the Jews back. And the Germans say, not a problem. This is a righteous Christian. His name is Jupe Westerweel. And he helped save my father's life. He's one of the righteous Christians in Yad Vashem. He's the principal of the Montessori school in Rotterdam. My father, since May of 1942, has been put into he's been put into, with 72 other German Jewish orphans, another agricultural school. And they become great friends. They're together for over a year. And one day, he sends a message to them, the Germans are coming for you. And since my father and another boy are the youngest, they're the first ones who are allowed to go out after curfew. And he's hidden. And for 4 months, he's hidden in, I can't tell you how many Dutch people risk their lives for my dad. The first place he goes to, I'll tell you, I never came home with a book from school that my dad hadn't read. And I'm like, you keep telling me you went to school till 1939. When did you read this book? And years later, I realized that the first place he went for 3 months was a Montessori school attic. And he read and he read and he read. That was his prison experience. But he was in the houses of poor people, to rich people, until finally he got his wish. They didn't dye his hair, but they gave him papers of an Aryan. My father used to say, I was resurrected. And really, years after the war, my father would still cross himself before he ate, out of habit. And so he goes to a farm, and he almost dies because he's got food. He had a handful of cornmeal was his ration a week. And eating almost kills him. This gentleman takes 300 Jewish children through the Pyrenees to Spain. And on the way back, the Germans capture him, torture him, and murder him, leaving his 4 children without a father, but saving hundreds of Jews. Not to grab your kishkas, but this picture is taken outside of the orphanage in Bedzin, Poland. After the orphanage is cleared, which is before this picture is taken, the Judenrat puts any new Jews coming to the ghetto here, so that when the Germans come and ask for a quota of Jews, they send out people not from Bedzin before they send people from Bedzin. And here these unfortunate women and children are on their way. By now, people from Auschwitz are escaping and coming to Bedzin, just like the Treblinka Jews went to Faramonti. And there's very little doubt about where the deported people are going. This is Sur. You can see how gaunt she is, wearing her Jewish star. In 1942, my mother's older sister is deported and not seen from again. I don't know exactly when, but I know my mother would never forget the date. 7,000 Jews are deported that year in early May. Another 2,400 of non-productive Jews are also deported. And then about 20,000 Jews in the ghetto are brought to a football field here in the upper left, conveniently next to these train tracks. And 8,000 to 10,000 Jews are sent away in a nightmarish day on August 15th, 1942. It's everything horrible that you would imagine about a roundup, from children being thrown down, shot in their parents' arms, just horror. And now all the Jews are moved down into this one Kamyanoka suburb, 15,000 Jews from what was once 30,000, really less than 15,000 because Jews are dying of natural causes. Jacob Kartus, the oldest brother, his ID card is here. There are about 9,000 ID cards found in Bedzin because besides being a large ghetto, it's one of the last ones that are liquidated. And he's deported in 1943 and worked to death at Gross Rosen. So as I said, the ghetto is now quiet. These are not the Kartush girls. These are just 2 girls in what's left of an emptying ghetto. The first time I thought of killing myself, my mother began. Was in June of 1943. My mother had died a month before because she didn't have medicine. My father was devastated. 2 of his oldest children gone, his wife gone. And Itamalka, her bubby, calls her over. I forgot to share that 2 months after the Germans came in, Ruchala was born in 1939, the 6th Kartush child. She says, Yaja, don't leave the girls, Yaja. Stay with your sisters. Stay with Pesala. Stay with Rivka. Stay with Ruchala. Promise me, Yaja. Yeah, promise me. My mother, it was God asking. She said, of course. And then Itamalka died. And then Yaja, my mother, her father's deported to Auschwitz. And she says in June, by then the Judenrat, who decides which Jews stay in Bedzin, were sent to Auschwitz. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was crushed already. They brought us and we knew what was happening. Before, they didn't mind if a Jew got away here or there. But when the Jews went with their families and hid in the cornfield, the Germans set the cornfield on fire. And as we walked to the selection point, we heard the screams. And they grabbed me. They took me away from my sisters. And I ran to a building, to a window, and thought, if I jump from here, will it kill me? And then God sent a German soldier, and I thought, here's my salvation. I have death by German. But the German brought her back, and she was put in a train to Gross Rosen. And there wasn't a quiet moment in my mother's life when she didn't hear, Yaja, stay with your sisters. Stay with your sisters. And Ruchel 3, Rivka 8, and Pesla 8, a year older, did not have a long ride to Auschwitz. But it was a ride that my mother could never stop imagining as she let me into the torture chamber that memory had built for her. There's a Bendin ghetto uprising. This poor Yid came from the Warsaw ghetto, Frumpa Planitka, and died in the Bendin ghetto with the last 2,000 Jews. 2 Jewish women from Bendin in 1944 sneak gunpowder and blow up the crematoria in Auschwitz. Meanwhile, my mother is taken from Bendin to Gross Rosen, and then she goes to Klettendorf, where in the snow with rags on her feet, she shovels the roads to clear them for the Bayerischer Motorwerk Company. My mother wasn't very fond of German cars after that. So the scariest words come to the women who are next to their men in this concentration camp. They say, ladies, we're sorry, this concentration camp is full. We need to make room. But instead of going to Auschwitz, they're taken to Ludwigsdorf, leaving, for those who had husbands, leaving them behind. When I was in Israel on pilgrimage in 1976, I think, Laura, you were there with me, Regina was my mother's bunkmate in concentration camp. And she said that my mother saved her life. They would walk 8 miles one way in wooden shoes to the munitions factory where they had to work. And saying that next to her daughter was a powerful experience for me. But it really is before I knew what my mother had gone through. And in many respects, I think that Regina saved my mother's life. The munitions factory is underground, by the way. So what's Opa, my grandfather, doing over here with Cardinal Duca? In March, the Jews of Faramonte here, they're going to be handed over to the Germans. They send a representative to the Pope and say, please. And he comes, and he tells them, don't worry, we'll do everything we can to keep you from being grabbed by the Germans. And then, in July that year, 43, the British invade Italy. Optimism grows. 30 couples get married in 5 weeks. And 4 more fatalities happen because a British plane comes over and sees what looks like a camp and strafes it, killing 4 of the Pencho Jews. Again, amazingly, in September, the commander has to leave and he says, we need to make ID cards for these Jews. Because if the Germans come, they're going to pick these Jews up. They need to go out of the camp. And so, a nice smile from Zali, he leaves with about 1,950 other Jews. And all the peasants in the Italian hills bring them in and feed them, as if they weren't starving themselves. In June, they get to Palestine. June 1944, they're liberated. 1 month later, remember the 5 Penchoers who stayed in Rhodes? This is a month after the Allies have invaded Normandy. The Germans, Brennensalze, the Germans put the 1,700 Jews on a barge, a coal barge, and take them to Auschwitz, where only 150 survived. That's what they were doing when they had other business than fulfilling a prophecy. If you're ever in Netanya, I didn't know this until a week ago, visit the Pencho Memorial. If you get there before me, take a picture of Anna and Zali Danziger's name and send it to me.
That's in South Netanya or North Netanya?
I'm sorry. Use Waze. I promised to bring you back here, but my mother and my father are still in the trap. In August of 1944, my Aryan daddy is picked up by the German army because they want anybody who's strong enough to fill a sack with sand or dig a ditch to come. And they pick up my dad and a few other locals. And in Limburg, my father hears one German tell another, the SS is going to be coming tomorrow. We're going to hand these guys over. And now with American planes come and strafe the bombardment. Everybody jumps in a ditch. They're not my dad. He runs back to the town where they picked him up. And there he's almost shot by an American sentry. But he's a lot happier being shot by an American than by a German. And he's lucky to be liberated at this time. Because that month is the hunger winter. Tens of thousands of Dutch starved to death who are not liberated. Of the 72 Jews in the HaShoah with my dad, 5 survived. In Holland, where Uncle Marcus took my father off, 70% of the Jewish community died. My mother goes into her grave every day, this underground munitions factory. She's alive, really, because they're out of Jews. There's no one to come and send to replace them. The Jews they're moving now are moving for one reason, to kill them in Auschwitz. And my mother goes in, and except for the Jews dying of malnutrition, or beaten to death by a capo, or dying from the chemicals, or work accidents, and humiliating searches every day to make sure no gunpowder is left. My mother waits and waits. 1,000 days she's in the ghetto. 700 days as a slave. And in May, the Germans say, we're going to go for a walk. But the Russians come faster than they imagine. And in the morning, there are no German guards there. They really don't know what to do. The women sit there, and then, out of a movie, they hear singing. These are Hebrew love songs. And they look outside, and the men from Klettendorf are coming for their wives and for their sisters. But where's Alexander Kartus? My mother senses that her father is still alive. She looks and looks. Actually, first she has TB and almost dies, and Alexander Kartus, he's alive. He died here. 100 stories. The accepted truth, perhaps because it's more horrible, is that 2 days before the final marches were being done out of Auschwitz, Alexander was in the infirmary. His brother was a doctor and got him into the infirmary. And these Jews in the infirmary couldn't walk, couldn't go on a death march. So the Germans killed them, and then they killed the people who watched them kill. None of the siblings live. None of the parents' siblings live. 150 members of my family perish in the Holocaust. Shir Hamalot, These words bring me comfort often. We often reap and joy what we sow in tears. But the honest truth is, my parents were wounded. These Holocaust survivors who came out of the war were generally the age of my parents. They had no opportunity for education. They didn't know the language of the countries they were in. They were poor. They couldn't go anywhere because they were still in DP camps in the 1950s. You know why? The Immigration Act of 1924. And so, Taka, even though Aunt Mary's in England, her mother can't visit her and see her till 1957. She doesn't have 2 nickels to go anywhere. She can't Facebook with her. In fact, they still wonder, is someone alive somewhere? You know, there was a story this week about people finding each other after 77 years. Whenever my mother heard one of those stories growing up, she'd go in her room, close the door, and come out 2 days later. Where is my family? And so, my father. Maybe. Sorry, I don't have this. Didn't set up the speakers for you. Oh, maybe not. What my father says.
I'm 65 now. And I see it. Everything was suffering periodically. I get blankets. You get H6. You get feeling less than everybody else. And he's going through everything. It's not something you realize something. And you feel different when you come to that. That's not the point. That's not right. You always feel less than everybody else because there's the movement you have. This kid.
I just like this picture. It's Mother's Day, Sunday. My mother here, 16 years out of the concentration camp. I forgot to mention, my dad was liberated a month before his 18th birthday, 12 years after the Holocaust began for him. My mother was 16. Here we're going to Germany. You know why? My parents came to the United States in 1956. I was born here. They came to the United States because my father was German. He made the German quota. 32 frickin' years after the Immigration Act. The parents wanted to come with their grandson, Alex, born in Israel. But they couldn't. Polish quota. And finally they go back. That's why my grandmother meets Mary again. And she gets to Germany. They go to Germany because the Germans paid double reparations for anybody who would come back. So instead of being, excuse me, piss poor, you could just be regular poor. And she dies of a broken heart. My mother comes up with this great plan, we're all going to move to Germany. And I'm here in her lap, moving to Germany, which lasted about 3 months before my mother had a nervous breakdown. And so, it's not just them. 1 out of 3 Holocaust survivors in the United States is poor. How could they be anything but? In Israel, Holocaust survivors report they have to skip meals. Can you imagine that? And so I learned this week that in Greater Middlesex County and in Monmouth County, they didn't anticipate the increase in demand in services. It's hard to tell with people so old exactly when they will need services. And so Federation has had to reduce services to 250 Holocaust survivors and refuse services to others. If you tonight, I know there are baskets going around, can throw money in, or for those of you who want to give more money, and I hope there are many of you than you have in your wallet, go to supportholocaustsurvivors.org, please, and make a donation. Any donation made in this week will be doubled. Is that right, Rabbi?
Yes, that's correct.
And I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.